It's Wednesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Claire Coutinho, Labour MP Angela Eagle, New Statesman Britain editor Anoosh Chakalian and Conservative Home Chief Executive Mark Wallace. Today, would you say this about your boss?
What I heard on the doorstep is didn't know what Keir Starmer stood for, so that's what I think our challenge is actually.
Criticism of Keir Starmer from all sides today. Tony Blair says without total change, the party could die.
I do believe that it's essential that we have a full, proper public inquiry.
Will the Prime Minister announce more details today? And is university free speech under attack?
What we're seeing in our universities and some of our universities is a chilling effect of a cancel culture and censorship.
The Prime Minister is expected in the House of Commons in the next few minutes to make a statement on COVID. We'll bring you anything important that he says at some point throughout the programme. Now, I want to return to what you heard there, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, talking about Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. Let's listen to a little bit more. She was talking to Laura Kunsberg.
What I heard on the doorstep is didn't know what Keir Starmer stood for, so that's what I think our challenge is actually. It's not, people briefing, saying we think Keir thinks this, we think Keir thinks that, but actually about, well, what are we doing? What are our policies around that? Well, I'm not going to discuss what, the robust conversations that me and Keir have, and I've always had, we've had a very frank relationship, and I welcome that, actually. I think it's really constructive.
Angela Rayner. Anoosh, and my opening question to all of you, would you be that honest about your boss in public, Anoosh?
Well, I haven't had to be, luckily. So I'm going to leave my lucky editor out of it. But yes, I mean, it really doesn't bode well, does it, for unity within the Labour Party that Keir Starmer's own deputy is willing to say this on the BBC. It shows that there is indeed a crisis within the party. And as you said, from all sides, Tony Blair has said in the New Statesman in a piece today that the Labour Party could die. So you have the left of the party and the right of the party saying it's not enough just to change the leadership. Keir Starmer hasn't done enough in terms of policy, in terms of a project to appeal to voters.
Mark, what about you? Would you ever be that frank about a boss?
Well, part of the difficulty is, of course, that it turns out Keir Starmer isn't Angela Rayner's boss. Her boss are the members of the Labour Party who elected her to be deputy leader. So he did the bizarre thing of trying to sack her from one job while she couldn't be sacked from deputy leader. So he's now in the position essentially of having publicly dumped her, but still having to share a flat together. And now this is what happens as a result. Right.
Well, Claire, you're Parliamentary Private Secretary to Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor. Would you like to give us a frank assessment of what you think of him?
Well, I mean, I think I have to agree with most people when they talk about him, and it's a hard to find fault. He's a great guy. He works very hard. He's a thoroughly decent person, and he's got a huge brain, which I'm always very pleased that it's being put to the good of the country.
Right, and is that your frank assessment, or is that just the one you keep for public?
That is my hand on heart assessment.
OK. Angela Rayner perhaps could take some tips, do you think, Angela?
Well, look, I think that we've lost 4 elections in a row. We've had a disappointing election result, although some bright spots over the last few days. Any political party which wants to come back has got to have a frank assessment. It's not necessarily fantastically helpful that it's all being done in public. But I do think that we've got to get back to some thinking about our values and why we exist. We exist to make society better. We've got values of liberty, democracy, equality, cooperation, internationalism. How do we make those values? How do we make our vision of society something that we can appeal to people about? Now, that begins by thinking through how you project these values forward to the problems people have now. It then becomes an issue of how you communicate that.
Yes. But that's the issue, isn't it, Angela, that the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, I know it's a bit complicated with you both called Angela, that on the doorstep people, she said, didn't know what Keir Starmer and the Labour Party stood for. Is honesty perhaps the best policy? I mean, is she right?
I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with honesty. I think that we have to have an honest appraisal of where we are and what we can do to improve the way that we communicate our politics. But that also begins with how we can reapply our eternal values, and I've just mentioned some of them, to the problems that people in our society face today. There's no reason why we can't do that. There's no reason why, for example, with 1 in 10 people being asked to take pay cuts when they come back into their jobs after the COVID pandemic, we shouldn't be having something to say about employment rights and how employers and employees can work together in each other's interests rather than the one exploit the other.
Right.
That is one example.
Could Angela Rayner be the next leader of the Labour Party? Angela?
Look, I'm instinctively in favour of Angela's, but the point is that will not solve any of our issues at the moment. We have to work together. The Labour Party has always been quite a complex sort of party with all sorts of power bases in it.
Well, maybe that's why people don't know what you stand for.
Well, no, it isn't. I mean, the Labour Party is a complex thing to run, but the leader of the opposition is the most difficult job in government. We've got to support Keir. We've got to make certain that we start articulating our values, and I've just talked about some of them, and talk about policies that would help everybody in the country, and then communicate them properly. I don't think we've updated the way that we communicate. We know that there's been a lot of propaganda via Facebook, which turns up on the doorstep, surreptitiously bought by the Conservatives. They've innovated in this kind of way. We have to match them and get better at it. Right.
Anoosh, you talked in your opening remarks about the New Statesman cover there. Without total change, Labour will die. That's a pretty damning title there from former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair. What's he actually talking about?
Well, he's, Angela mentioned updating the message. He is essentially talking about that. He says museum pieces as a description for the same old talking points about big state, tax and spend, public ownership. He thinks the Labour Party needs to be more contemporary and talk about the revolution in technology, for example. Otherwise, it's going to be out of date and already is. And he does talk about a complete deconstruction and reconstruction of the party along the lines of a sort of new progressive alliance. He talks about opening a dialogue between Labour and Lib Dem members, for example. So I think he's talking about a sort of massive revolutionary shift in how the party works, who it represents, and also what it always talks about as well. Because the Labour Party has been talking about itself, ever since it lost power, really, in 2010, it has been talking about itself, where its soul is, who should be dictating what policies it puts to the public. And I think that's going to be the next big battle.
Mark, I'd like you to comment on this other quote that we have here from that same piece in the New Statesman. Keir seems sensible, says Tony Blair, but not radical. He lacks a compelling economic message, and the cultural message, because he's not clarifying it, is being defined by the woke left, whose every statement gets cut through courtesy of the right. Do you agree with that analysis?
To a large extent, yes. I don't always agree with Tony Blair about things, as you know, but I think there are several things he puts his finger on here. What I think he's overlooking to some extent is that it's easier to diagnose the problem, particularly that issue of the very vocal and very publicly out of touch, as he puts it, woke or radical kind of hard left elements of the Labour Party getting a lot of the airtime. But it's much easier to diagnose than it is to resolve. Of course, even he back in the 90s had to have a huge amount of authority, a huge amount of power internally over his party, and then did a huge amount of work, notably, of course, with his deputy, drawn from the more traditional old Labour side, John Prescott, to get him on side and to build that power base in order to force his party to do a lot of things it didn't necessarily want to. The problem Keir Starmer's now in is he kept his powder dry, partially because he didn't feel he had enough power to really see off the Corbynites last year. He's now losing authority as he loses elections and council seats and now a by-election. And it gets more urgent for him to show authority just as it seeps away from him.
Right, Angela, you wanted to come in.
I think that a lot of this so-called woke stuff is actually a war provoked by the right and Spike Devine and the people who are in Downing Street. I think that people who are demonstrating to have equal rights and access to jobs and respect, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's LGBT people, are just trying to be a part of society. And I don't think that they should be shut up by people telling them that somehow they can't assert their rights to equality.
Right.
So I think that we've got to be very careful. A lot of the stuff that's coming and being covered in the Tory tabloids and the press in this hysterical way is actually confected deliberately to try to cause us problems and to shut up people who want to make society more progressive.
Right. Well,
so
let's
I
get
think
Claire.
we've got to be very careful about caricaturing.
Right, well, let's get Claire to respond. It's a Downing Street strategy. It's a confected row when it comes to wokeness or the culture wars designed by Number 10.
Well, I mean, I think you should look at the number of Labour figures who have come out now and said that they find this an issue in their party. This is not just coming from the right. And actually, the incident that I think the Tony Blair pulled up particularly was defund the police. That's not about equality for jobs for people of ethnic minority backgrounds, something that I would hugely support, of course. But it's about, I think, having quite toxic policies which are alienating voters, which is why you saw the results you did last week.
Angela?
Well, defund the police was an American slogan that happened after the incident in Minneapolis. This didn't happen in the UK, so it's not even this example that's being quoted now is something that didn't even happen in the UK. It's legitimate for Black, Asian, ethnic minority people to want to have an equal right to citizenship in the UK and to not be discriminated against, whether it's by bad policing errors or whether it's by access to the labour market. It's perfectly reasonable for people to demonstrate about that in a democracy without being shut up by being told that somehow they're not allowed to.
Claire?
Well, I mean, I don't think the question of shutting up people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds is what other people in the Labour Party are saying is the issue. And of course, again, I would say I am perfectly behind trying to have equality for people from ethnic minority backgrounds. The issue is that you've got some of these things like defunding the police. And I would say that's not me mentioning that. That's Tony Blair who mentioned that, which are very toxic policies which people don't agree with. And that's nothing to do with equality for ethnic minority people.
Angela?
Nobody's asking for the police to be defunded in the UK. That was a slogan that happened in the uprisings following the issue in Minnesota. I mean, obviously, it's correct that we should have proper policing with respect to all communities. Nobody's asking for the police to be defunded. The only people that have defunded the police has been the government in the last 10 years of austerity, which cut 60,000 police officers, a government that can't even deliver timely access to the courts. We've got 3 and 4 year delays for the Crown Courts. Let's talk about funding the justice system properly, and let's hold the Conservatives to account for the cuts and austerity that they created in all these areas.
Mark,
I mean, that's exactly why we spent that election talking about investing in public services like schools, health and policing. And that's exactly why people responded to us. And I think the Labour Party, if they want to get the same response, should perhaps spend more time on that and less time on these other toxic issues.
Right. Well, let's go back to the point that was made by Tony Blair, Anoush and Mark. Anoush, is this a confected row, or is this something people might remember, for example, Keir Starmer taking the knee? I mean, are these things that have been to some extent exploited by the right, as Angela is saying, or are these real issues?
I think the point is that whether it's a confected row that's being whipped up by the Conservative Party because they know it hits Labour where it hurts, or whether there's sort of imported ideas from the US that perhaps are less vocally communicated here or not, it doesn't really matter. What matters, I think, which Tony Blair is trying to say in his piece, is how the Labour Party responds to it. And actually, his argument is that it doesn't work to bury your head in the sand and try and ignore these issues, like I think Keir Starmer has tried to do, to try and break away from Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. He's tried not to engage on that battleground. And actually, what Tony Blair is saying, you can't control what questions people ask you. You have to have a response for it. And, his view is that you have to take the public with you. So while it's legitimate to criticise, certain activities of the police, you can't suggest that you're against the police if you're going to win the votes that you need, for example. And so I think the lesson for Keir Starmer and his leadership is that you're not going to be be able to get away from this row, even if it is confected. So you have to have a response to it, and you have to look confident in your response to it as well.
Mark?
Yes, frankly, I agree with Angela that various of these different slogans and ideas are a very poor fit for British politics and for the reality of life in the UK. But that's one reason why it's so strange that there are, like it or not, prominent figures on the left of British politics and the left of the Labour Party who are trying to kind of use them as rallying cries. It's a very strange thing to do. It's not very wise. Look at the really stark example last year when it was news when Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, publicly condemned the idea that mobs should decide whether a statue stands or falls. Some Labour politicians at that time were not willing to do so. And you can believe in racial equality, you can believe in proper scrutiny and discussion of the realities of history, you can believe in all of these things and still find it easy to say mob justice is not acceptable. Some people don't seem to find it possible to say that, and that is stark, and voters notice it, whether you like it or not. Angela, final word from you on this?
Well, I think that we have to have a reasonable and open discussion about the history of slavery in our country, and I represent, albeit over the river, a region which has done that with the Slavery Museum in Liverpool. I think it's important that we make sure that our ethnic minority colleagues and citizens feel comfortable in a country which is coming to terms with its history. There's nothing wrong with having open and full debate about that. Obviously, that doesn't mean that one's in favour of mob rule. I mean, this is just a caricature.
Right, we're going to leave it there. I'm going to welcome the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young. Vicky, story revealed by Private Eye about Boris Johnson and being issued with a county court judgment for unpaid debt last October. We can just show our viewers here. There it is, called Unsatisfied Record. The amount is £535, delivered to 10 Downing Street.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? There it is in black and white, the court order naming Mr Johnson of number 10 Downing Street on the 26th of October, as you say. This is according to a database of judgments. Now, of course, there's a lot we don't know about this, and Downing Street haven't been able to enlighten us any further. We have asked them several questions, of course. So, for example, who does he owe the money to? What is it for? In these cases, a court doesn't rule unless they've given the person a chance to pay the debt. That's what usually happens. So, you know, there's letters coming through the letterbox, maybe in red writing, warning someone that they owe money. We have no idea whether Boris Johnson received those and why he hasn't paid. Now, of course, this comes after lots of speculation about his personal finances, the very expensive refurbishment of the flat that he lives in number 11 Downing Street. And now, anecdotally, there are people who tell stories about Boris Johnson. One I spoke to used to work with him at City Hall, saying he didn't ever cough up for the coffee round. And Max Hastings, who said that there was a bet which Boris Johnson lost and he never paid up for that either. But, of course, this is slightly different.
Yes, this is a formal unpaid debt.
Yes, and the question is, what is it for? Why didn't he pay it? Is it because he can't afford to pay it? He earns £157,000 a year, a huge salary, but of course not as large as the salary he used to earn before he became Prime Minister. Unusually, he took a big pay cut. He earned nearer £800,000, and he has gone through a divorce as well, so a divorce settlement. So lots of speculation about how much money he has and whether he can afford to spend any of this. The problem with this, of course, is it can affect your credit rating. It can mean that you can't get mortgages, you can't get loans, all of those issues. So incredibly embarrassing if this turns out to be what it looks like.
Or the bailiffs come knocking at number 10, no doubt.
I think it's not quite enough for that. It has to be over £600.
I see. Thank you for that detail. Vicky Young there. I mean, Claire, he is the First Lord of the Treasury. We may not know all the details, but this is unbelievably embarrassing, isn't it?
Well, I mean, you'll understand it'll be very hard for me to comment, as we don't really know any of the details, who's it for, whether he got the post. I mean, he was dealing with a pandemic last year. He had COVID at one point, so we don't really know what's happened here. But the one thing that I would say is that over the course of this election, we saw lots of things which were very sort of deeply personal attacks on the Prime Minister. And I think the thing that I took away from talking to people and seeing the results is that people really want us to be focusing on COVID recovery. So, yes, this is important. I'm sure it will be sorted out, but I really can't comment without knowing any of the further details.
Right, but as you say, it is important. He is the Prime Minister, and this is an unpaid debt that's been sent to number 10 Downing Street. How does it look, Mark?
Well, it's not ideal. Firstly, fair to say, fair play to Private Eye for showing up the rest of the media for actually searching for something this and finding it. It's been there for a few months and nobody else seems to have noticed. So credit to them. It's not, as Claire says, we don't know the exact details. I think it's fair to say that I don't think anybody would be hugely surprised to learn that Boris Johnson isn't always the world's most organised person, and certainly anyone in the media who's edited his columns in the past would attest to that, apparently. But yeah, I don't think really voters, it's perfectly legitimate to report on it, but I don't think voters are going to care much one way or the other.
Right, do you agree with that, Angela? They won't care. They didn't seem to in big enough numbers during the elections about questions around the refurbishment of his flat. He may be chaotic, but the important thing is dealing with the pandemic.
Well, I mean, we've got a financially incontinent Prime Minister who claims to be First Lord of the Treasury, who's not fit to look after the public finances. Other people who don't pay their debts get taken to court. And the chaotic lifestyle that everybody talks about has an effect on the decisions he makes. When the inquiry into the COVID pandemic and the government's handling of it gets to happen, we will see a man who was chaotic, who was complacent, who didn't react appropriately to the threat that COVID-19 actually presented us with. And as a result, tens of thousands of people who might have been saved died. And so I think that this kind of aspect of his character does bear very much on the kind of Prime Minister he is and the decisions that he makes.
Well,
and
since you've raised...
In the end, I think that the public will judge him for it.
Right. Well, since you've raised the issue of the COVID inquiry, I did say that we would bring you any update on what the Prime Minister has said in the House of Commons. And Boris Johnson says, I expect the right moment for that inquiry is to begin in spring 2022, so next year, and we'll come back to that. But Anoush, could I just get your response? Will voters take much more notice of this particular story about the County Court judgment, or have they sort of thought he is a pretty chaotic man when it comes to his own personal finances and personal life?
I think probably they have come to the conclusion that that is part of his character, and as we've seen, it hasn't necessarily affected him electorally yet. But the drip of these stories constantly coming in do suggest that it is one rule for the Prime Minister and another for the public. I mean, if you've ever filed a tax return or if you've ever claimed benefits, you have to do it to the letter. The benefit sanctions regime is very punitive, whereas the Prime Minister has been found to have broken, failing to declare financial interests before in the Commons rules, and he's been accused of an overly sort of casual attitude towards those rules on filing his financial interests, and that was before the pandemic, so we can't really say that he was too distracted then. So I do think that it builds a picture. Whether or not it's affecting voters at the moment, it probably isn't, but it could do.
Right. Well, let's move on to a former Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, who is due to be questioned tomorrow about lobbying on behalf of Greensill Capital, lobbying government and civil servants. Now, Greensill Capital founder Lex Greensill was questioned yesterday by the committee that Angela sits on, the Treasury Select Committee. He was also asked about, obviously, why the firm collapsed, as well as his relationship with the former Prime Minister, David Cameron. But let's take a look at some of the texts that have been published from David Cameron. The first one is to Tom Scholar, who is the Permanent Secretary, the most senior civil servant at the Treasury. This was on the 6th of March last year. You can see there, I am riding to the rescue with supply chain finance with my friend Lex Greensill. My new job. See you with Rishi's, that's his typo, for an elbow bump or foot tap. Love, DC, David Cameron. Then, a month later, we can see another text, part of a whole series of WhatsApps and texts. In early April, David Cameron sent this text message to Cabinet Minister Michael Gove. I know you're manically busy and doing a great job, by the way, but do you have a moment for a word? I'm on this number and very free. All good wishes, DC. And then later on that same month, in April, he sends this WhatsApp message to the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. I'm sure that goodwill and common sense can fix this. In the end, the substance is what matters. Keep going on the rest. Incredibly tough, but the message is coming through well. Best wishes, DC. Claire, listening to those, and they are just a selection of the messages that were sent to ministers and civil servants, do you think the public will really accept that sort of cosy access on such a regular basis, it seems, through those months, from David Cameron to Rishi Sunak and others?
Well, I think David Cameron himself has already said that he wished he'd gone through a more formal route. And we've got this inquiry that the PM has put forward, which is being led by Nigel Boardman, which will review all of those communications. But the most important thing, I think, for me, when we're judging the robustness of the system against undue influence, is we can see how many texts were sent to a variety of people. And the answer that he got for his proposal was no. And that, to me, suggests actually there is robustness in the system, because despite all of these texts, the thing that he wanted, he was rejected for.
Angela, you're going to be putting questions. What are you going to ask David Cameron?
Well, I'm not going to give him a sort of 24 hours to prepare by telling you what I'm going to ask him. I think, we still actually don't know how Greensill Capital got access to the coronavirus large business interruption loan scheme. We know that he was turned down for a scheme that wasn't designed for a shadow bank, that was doing some very dubious things in terms of securitizing trades between companies that hadn't actually happened. But we still don't know whether the huge amount of lobbying and cozy sort of texts and phone calls that have now been revealed actually led to this shadow bank, which is unregulated, being given access to the coronavirus large business interruption loan scheme, which it then used, we know, to advance £400 million to the Gupta steel group, and its collapse means that public money is owed. Paul Miners, who gave evidence to the committee last week, says he thinks that the public losses as a result of Greensill Capital collapsing could reach up to £3 billion. And remember that David Cameron had some share options in this, which could have made him a multi-millionaire if this bank had ever actually succeeded in having a public offering. So he was pursuing this at the height of the pandemic while thousands of people were dying for his own enrichment. It's not a good look.
Right. Well, you've mentioned again the pandemic and the inquiry that I said Boris Johnson has talked about. Let's hear what the Prime Minister had to say in the Commons a few minutes ago.
I expect that the right moment for the inquiry to begin is at the end of this period in the spring of next year, spring 2022. And Mr. Speaker, I know that there will be some in this chamber and many bereaved families who will be anxious for this inquiry to begin sooner. So let me reassure the House that we are fully committed to learning the lessons at every stage of this crisis.
Anoush, spring 2022, is that the right time? Is it soon enough? And what will be the political significance of it?
Well, many bereaved families will be disappointed that it's that long off. They've been calling for it earlier than that for a long time, and the government has been putting it off. The problem with that, although they can make the argument that they've been very busy, which they have been, is that they've made the same mistakes over and over again. So each time they delayed the lockdown, each of the 3 lockdowns, the delay actually happened when there were more people in hospital with coronavirus each time. So they clearly weren't learning the lessons as they went along. So I think it shows that they're still sort of kicking it down the road. They know that it's going to be incredibly uncomfortable, not only on the delay of lockdowns, but on what happened in care homes, on the shortages of PPE, on our borders not being closed to other variants of the virus coming into the country, on the poor performance of NHS test and trace. So we'll have to see whether or not it really will be that full public inquiry that the Prime Minister said, sort of Chilcot or Leveson style, or whether it will be more of an independent inquiry in the style of sort of MPs select committee inquiries. We don't know quite what form it will take yet. But of course, if it is a judge-led one, then it could take years to report. So it will be a matter of what is most politically convenient for the government.
Right. Should it be an independent public inquiry with legal powers? I'm being told it is that, Claire. Why isn't it coming earlier?
Well, I think that the balance that government will have to strike is the use of people's time who also are meant to be spending time on dealing with the recovery and dealing with the pandemic itself. So it's hard to say of this government that we haven't faced scrutiny along the way, whether it's select committee appearances or intense public and media scrutiny for every single decision that we've taken. And I do think it's right that they get that balance right in terms of using people's time to take forward the inquiry, making sure that we're learning all of those lessons, but also giving them the time and space they need at the moment to deal with the pandemic itself.
Right. Angela, do you accept that there are still key figures involved in coming through this pandemic and out of the other side? We're told that the terms are going to be agreed with the other devolved administrations, and that is why that it will take some time.
I think that we should have had the inquiry begin much earlier. As was pointed out, the government has made the same mistakes over and over and over again. They have to explain why we have the largest percentage death rate in Europe, why we've had the largest economic contraction.
Well, hang on. Sorry, just to be clear, not death rate, had the largest number of deaths in Europe. I don't know if you said death rate, not the highest death rate.
Well, it's close to 150,000 now if you count those where COVID was actually on the deaths.
Well, just to be clear, the official number is something over 127,000. And while that is the highest number of deaths in Europe, it is not the highest death rate. We are actually, the UK, some way down. I think Hungary, unfortunately, finds itself there at the top.
Right. I still think 127,000 and it is an awful lot.
Of course.
And many of those lives could have been saved if the government hadn't kept making the same mistake.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the timing, Angela. Do you accept that it is fair?
I think if there'd have been some preliminary hearings last summer, the government might have avoided the delays that caused the second wave to be so much worse than the first wave. It should have been much more open and transparent about what it was doing. And instead, the Prime Minister was in a big row with his own party, the Libertarians in his own party, who wanted them to pursue the Swedish model and not lock down at all, which, as we've seen from Sweden's figures, has caused them to have the highest death rate in the Scandinavian and Nordic countries, and they've suffered far worse than those who did lock down. Right. So I do think that lives could have been saved if there'd have been an inquiry beginning to sit earlier with some initial responses that could have helped the government respond more appropriately than it did.
Right. It is going to have quite a lot of power in terms of the inquiry, Mark. How damaging do you think it could be for Boris Johnson?
Well, that all depends on what it ends up finding, but it also depends to a certain extent on the timescale, of course. Frankly, I think and what Angela was just saying a moment ago is pretty severely misguided. I think it's hard to imagine. I've yet to hear an answer. How many days should Chris Whitty and Jonathan Van Tam and their teams and staff have taken off doing their job of fighting the pandemic, say last summer, as Angela just suggested, in order to marshal evidence and put together documents and give evidence and so on? I don't think there is an answer really that would be acceptable to people. They should have taken, a week off last August to do it, a month, who knows? But we also have a bigger issue here, which is in this country, we have a pretty sorry history, frankly, of public inquiries that are not well targeted enough, that drag on for far too long, cost far too much, and don't end up bringing as much insight as they ought to. So be it Chilcot or the Bloody Sunday inquiry, for example, we need to make sure that this inquiry is very clear about what it wants, which is clear conclusions on what was done right, what was done wrong, and how to implement actual practical changes in the future. But just as importantly, it's got to proceed quite swiftly. It can't drag on for the next decade. Yeah. Otherwise, that causes more suffering. We miss the opportunity to learn lessons, and it wastes a ton of money in doing so.
Do you agree with that, Anoush, that actually perhaps is more important, that it doesn't take years and years to actually deliver some sort of judgment rather than perhaps when it starts?
I do agree, actually. I do think that that's a really important point to make. The problem is that, people's memories of pandemics, which I've looked into, are very short because we'd rather forget. It's a human response. We'd rather forget such a horrible time in our recent history. There are no memorials to the victims of the Spanish flu, for example. And if you compare that to the number of war memorials there are in this country, that shows that sort of pandemic amnesia that we have. We don't want the inquiry to drag on and on and on, because it means that we're more likely to sort of forget the people who were failed by the political decisions that turned out to be wrong. We know at the moment we're sort of in the throes of the vaccine program going well, restrictions lifting, every few weeks, summer ahead of us. We're in an optimistic phase, but we won't want to forget the suffering and also, of course, the impact of some of those decisions that will be long lasting. For example, the record sort of NHS waiting list that we have now. So I think it's important to keep it fresh in people's minds, and therefore it shouldn't drag on and, like Mark says, lose its focus or go off on tangents or not sort of pin down what the actual mistakes were.
Well, following on from what you've just said, Anoush, the Prime Minister has announced there will be a UK commission on COVID commemoration, remembering those that have lost their lives during the pandemic. We're going to move on to something different, which is the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill, one of the proposed pieces of legislation announced in the Queen's speech yesterday, and it's being introduced in Parliament today. It'll be a duty on universities to promote freedom of speech and issue fines for those institutions that don't comply with that. This is the Times headline, New Laws to Protect University Free Speech. Claire, can you give us an example of the problem this bill is trying to tackle?
Yes, so I think firstly, I should say that this issue of freedom of speech in universities, I think some of the left have tried to paint this as an issue that only the right cares about. But if you look at people like Germaine Greer or Barack Obama, who's spoken very passionately about this in the States, freedom of speech is something which should matter to all of us. And, from the examples of whether it's visiting speakers like Amber Rudd being cancelled to speak, former Home Secretary, former Secretary of Women and Equalities on International Women's Day, or whether it's the chilling effect on academia, which means that academics are less likely to put forward controversial or unpopular opinions because they fear that there'll be a risk to their job or potential promotion or privileges. I think it is really critical that we are making sure that our world-leading universities are thriving hubs of freedom of free speech.
All right, and we're going to come back to the measures in just a moment. But Angela, do you agree that this is a real issue?
Look, I think that freedom of speech is important, but I think that this is a distraction from the real issues that went on in higher education during the COVID crisis, where many students have been left paying for accommodation they couldn't be in. They've had their education massively disrupted, and nobody's really been, the government hasn't been thinking of them and supporting them appropriately. There's been a survey done of the 10,000 speaking engagements that happened across the sector. 6 have been cancelled. You might say that that's 6 too many, but I don't think that means that there's a huge threat to freedom of speech. So I think that this is a bill that continues the kind of war on shadow sort of woke stuff that the government keeps going on about as a distraction from the real issues that are happening in education, and that is how do you deal with the mental stresses and strains that have been caused by what's going on? How do you give students a fair deal who've had to pay for accommodation they haven't been able to use? How do you make sure that they get appropriate access to the labour market and that their qualifications are properly acknowledged? That's what Gavin Williamson should really be doing, not messing around with this.
Right. Mark, what do you say in response to what Angela said?
Well, in the words of the famous meme, why not both? I mean, the fact is that this does matter. It's not just an issue of, as was just put yet again, woke politics. If you talk to, for example, activists in British universities in defence of the rights of Hong Kongers who report having faced intimidation, even physical violence in some cases, on campus in British universities from, for example, advocates of the position of the Chinese government, this spreads across a lot of different policy areas. And it isn't just confined to universities. People used to say, oh, well, when they get to the world of work, they'll grow out of it. They're not doing so. What's happening is this view that free speech, the limits on speech should be dictated by the most easily offended, is leaching into the workplace, even in the world of, say, publishing and newspapers. We've seen controversies on that recently. So it does need dealing with. I would like to see the government be consistent across the board. And that means that we shouldn't be banning being annoying on protests. And we need to be careful with things like the online harms bill and making sure that actually there's a right to free speech in all aspects of our life.
Anoush, where do you see it?
Yes, I would agree actually with that contradiction. You know, you have on the one hand the government following this policy, this championing this bill, which is supposed to be about freedom of speech, but then, as you say, in the Policing Crime and Sentences bill, cracking down on peaceful protests, and also trying to introduce mandatory photo IDs for voters, which also, you know, runs roughshod over this impression that they want to stand up for civil liberties. So I do think that they are using this as a political device more than a genuine policy, particularly as universities are already legally required to have a code of practice on free speech.
Yes.
So, you know, it's over-legislating for an over-exaggerated issue.
Well, Claire, on that, can you respond? I mean, there is already the legislation there in place. Why do you need to have more?
Well, I think this idea that this is just an issue that the right is putting forward is total rubbish. And if you look at some of the surveys of academics in terms of how comfortable they feel putting forward controversial opinions, this is a widespread issue. And just to some of the other points that Lucy mentioned, mandatory voter ID, again, that's not an issue of the right. That's something that we're working on very closely with the Independent Electoral Commission to boost confidence in democracy. If you look at protests, we're absolutely going to allow peaceful protests. That's something which is, again, an important part of our democracy. It's about disruptive protests. So I think there's this narrative on the left to try and paint all these issues as issues of the right instead of issues which everyone should care about in terms of upholding our democracy.
Anoush?
Well, I don't agree, actually. I mean, this issue has been looked into and found to have been not as big a problem as is being sort of mythologized by the right. The Joint Committee on Human Rights looked into freedom of speech in universities in 2018 and concluded that they just couldn't find this sort of wholesale censorship of debate that has been talked up in media stories in the right-wing press, for example. So it's just not there. I think there was a really stark figure that found 0.09% of events in English universities that had sort of outside speakers booked were not approved. I mean, this is not the widespread problem that the right is painting it as.
Right, but that was a survey of student unions. I mean, we have had other examples, Anoush and Angela, the former Home Secretary that Claire mentioned, Amber Rudd, saying she had an invitation to speak at an Oxford University Society event, pulled half an hour before she was due to appear following a vote of its committee, understood to relate to her role in the Windrush scandal. And then Selina Todd, an Oxford academic, was no-platformed by the Oxford International Women's Festival, told by event organisers the decision was due to pressure from trans activists. Do you agree that this cancer culture is real, Angela?
I think that there are always occasions where people get cancelled. I mean, I can remember demonstrating outside the Oxford Union when I was a student there because Nixon had been asked to come and speak, just as you know. So you'll always get students expressing an opinion, but I think there's a massive overreaction, and I agree with Anoush, really. Look at the voter ID bill. 34 allegations of impersonation of voters out of 58 million votes cast. And so the government decides that it wants to make ID essential for voting, knowing that 3.7 million people who are more likely to vote for non-conservative candidates than conservative candidates are going to be denied access to the polling booths, and then they say it's strengthening democracy. It's Orwellian doublespeak.
Right.
And when this government talks about these non-issues, you know that they're doing it in their own for their own reasons, to help express power.
I'm just going to interrupt because we haven't got long, and I want to put to Claire. I mean, under these proposals, visiting speakers, academics, or students can seek compensation through the courts if a university breaches its free speech obligations. So, are you happy that a Conservative government wants the courts policing free speech, Claire?
While free speech, I think, is important. So I think it is important that people can seek redress if they think, for example, that their job or their promotion or their privileges or, speaking position has been jeopardized by people who are against free speech.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests today. Angela Eagle there still shaking her head, but that is all we've got time for. I will be back tomorrow at 12:15. Bye-bye.